Pretty loud. Welcome back, everybody. I hope you're having a good time until now. I'd like to introduce the next speaker. It's a respected colleague of mine, Mr. Avi Flax. He's from SFX New York, and I'm glad to have him here. He's a great person in general, but he has a lot of knowledge when it comes to software development and also micro web frameworks, which is what he will be talking about now. So the floor is all yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Berko. So I really love web microframeworks a lot, like irrationally love them. They're fantastic. They're such an important part of my toolbox and I think other people's. So, but let's, for a second before I talk about what could be better, let's talk about why I love web microframeworks for a second. So to introduce the main reason I love them so much, I'll introduce this guy. He was Dutch, I am not Dutch, so let's see if I can get this right. Edger Dijkstra. Okay, I could do better, I'll do better next time. So a famous computer scientist, did a lot of amazing writing. He actually wrote so many manuscripts and monographs that he came up with a numbering system for his manuscripts and monographs. So it was his initials, EWD, and then an integer. So he wrote, he has EWD 42 and EWD 78 and EWD 435 and et cetera, et cetera. So Edger Dijkstra, he cared about simplicity very much and he was a big proponent for simplicity in programming. He wrote, simplicity is a prerequisite for reliability in 1975. And he wrote, in programming, simplicity and clarity are a crucial matter that decides between success and failure. In EWD 648. So, this resonates with me, and I love microframeworks because they're so simple. There's no magic, there's no it's almost no complexity, as far as using them and as far as getting the job done, the simplicity is kind of breathtaking with the good ones. There's some, not so good ones out there, but forget about it. So let's first some examples of how they're so simple. Let's look at some code. In Bottle, here's how you create, you handle a HTTP request, a GET request comes in for slash, and you respond with a response with a particular body. It's beautiful. Flask, almost identical. The syntax, the way it looks, the way it works, it's just so easy and simple and straightforward. Easy and simple are not the same thing, but in this case, they go together. In Sinatra, get your method, your path, and then the block. I think I call it blocks in Ruby, right? Okay, and boom. Amazing. In Express, it's a little more complicated because it's JavaScript, there's callbacks, it's Node. I mean, let's not go there right now, okay? So, but still, it's still simple. Get the path, and then here's the function, and all it has to do is call the send method on the response, and there it is. I don't know if we have any people here who are familiar with Clojure, but I'm personally kind of have infatuation with Clojure right now. So one of the popular web micro frameworks for Clojure out there is called Compojure, and this is how you express the same thing in Compojure. So here, the method, the path, the response. Fantastic. So they're incredibly simple, and I love them because of that. But they can be a little bit better. Again, this is coming from a place of love, so it's constructive criticism, okay? So I love web microframeworks, but they can be a little better. Let's talk about how they can be a little better. So what do I mean? Well, it'd be nice if they would conform to HTTP just a little bit more, and both the letter and the spirit of HTTP. So just, again, I don't mean to be dramatic here. These frameworks are great. The great microframeworks are great, and for the most part, they do conform to HTTP. But there's a few specific areas and a few specific ways in which they can do a better job. And I think it's really interesting to see what those areas are and what we can learn from that. By the way, tell me if I'm going too fast. We can hold other questions to the end, but if I'm going too fast or if something really doesn't make sense, please just let me know. So in particular, I think that, well, okay, let me just move on. So the web is made of resources. This is the architecture of the web. This is the pieces of the web. the things that everything interacts with. Clients interact with them, servers implement them, caches cache the representations of the resources, and that's what it's made of. So when we implement resources programmatically, what we're doing is we're defining their behavior. In our code, we are saying, here is a resource, and here's how this resource should behave when certain things happen. Fundamentally, which means which methods they respond to and how they respond to those methods. So, how should a given resource respond to a get, a head, a put, post, delete, even maybe options? So most resources that we implement with Web Microframeworks, most of the time, they don't respond to certain of these methods properly as they should according to the HTTP spec RFC 2616, as we all know. So here's some specifics. Resources should respond to head requests. If there's a resource that you've implemented programmatically, that thing should respond to a head request, because that is part of the way that a resource is a good resource, and it kind of conforms the expectations that's set forth in the HTTP spec. Again, this is if a resource supports get. If a resource supports get, it should support head. So if you send a head request, you should get back a 200 OK. You should get back whatever the headers are, and you should not get back a body. A lot of microframeworks, instead you'll get this. You'll get back a 404, which is misleading and confusing, because that 404 means that resource doesn't exist. And you're like, wait a minute, I know that resource exists because I've done a get to that resource. Maybe I've got the URL wrong. It's just misleading. And now you have to think, well, what's going on here? Why am I getting the incorrect response? Either I did something wrong or the server's doing something wrong. Most of the microframers get this one right, but even some of them get even this one wrong. Resources should also respond to options. Options is hypothetically useful for auto-discovery and like adaptable, self-configuring on-the-fly clients, but it's actually really, really useful for humans. Human developers poking and prodding at a resource and seeing, what can I do with this thing? I've used options, and I've found it very useful, and I think there's a kind of a chicken and egg problem here. I think we'd all use options more frequently if more servers implemented it and more resources implemented it. But there's a lot of value to it, and it's part of the HTTP spec, and I think we should use it more. And so when you send an options request, you should get back a 200, and you should get back an allow header saying, here are the methods that are allowed on this resource. That's useful information. A lot of microframeworks will send you back a 404. Same problem. Confusing, misleading. What does this mean? Did I get something wrong? What's going on? Finally, if you send a request that's not supported, you should get back a 405. This method is not allowed. That's useful information. You send a put? Oh, you can't do a put. Don't eat that. Don't send that. You should get back a 405. You should not get back a 404. Again, confusing, misleading, and it causes problems. So here's a quick report card. You can see Flask is awesome. Love Flask. It's an A. Sinatra? No. But I don't, this is not me hating on Sinatra. This is empirical information. So in this particular aspect, Sinatra gets an F. And the other ones are kind of in the middle. And I think we can do better. So before we talk about solutions, I'll take a minute and talk about why I think this stuff matters, because you might be kind of saying this is esoteric, nobody uses these headers, these methods, who really cares? So why do these matter? I think this matters because the web is made of resources. The web isn't made of routes or procedures or paths. It's made of these things called resources. That's the abstraction. And those are the things we interact with, whether we're interacting with them directly via some user agent, or whether we are writing code that interacts with them, or we're writing a client that somehow figures out how to interact with them. Those are the things. And clients, intermediaries, such as proxies, and developers, they expect resources to conform to HTTP. That's an expectation. It's a shared expectation we all have. And that's kind of what enables the web to be such an amazing medium for us all to share and interchange and build things together that all interrelate and interconnect and interoperate. And if you don't conform to those expectations, then you are limiting our ability to interoperate successfully, to build amazing things, and it just slows things down, causes confusion. So for example, head and options are really useful tools for poking and prodding at resources and discovering how to interact with them, whether you're doing it programmatically or you're doing it manually. If you send a request to a resource that you know exists, you've interacted with it before, recently, but you get a 404, which implies it doesn't exist. Well, this is confusing and it's misleading, and it just, again, it's a tax. It slows things down. So I think this stuff matters. You might ask, well, maybe it only matters for APIs, right? People are only really using the full breadth of HTTP methods with APIs, right? The put and the post and the delete for sure. Put and delete, but also, of course, absolutely, like head and options. Who's using those except for the APIs? Well, people are using them actually. So here's my perspective. First of all, I don't think there's fundamentally, really deeply a difference between an API or a web application or a website. They're all made of resources, and they all need to implement HTTP properly. Concretely, options is really important for CORS, cross-origin resource sharing. If you implement options correctly, then CORS works better, and people should know about options and should know about CORS. Head is important for caching and for proxies. They use head to see, does this resource exist? What's its state? What's going on? Some clients use head to kind of say, if I wanted to do a get to this resource, how large would it be? Like, can I handle this, the memory size? Do I have the bandwidth to get this thing, to find out what size it is, when it was last updated? It's a way to get the metadata effectively for a current representation of a resource. That's super useful. You think about, a way to get metadata for something. Wow, that's broadly useful. We should probably use that. Finally, I think people will always try to use every website programmatically. It doesn't matter what you call it. If you call it an API, or you call it a website, you call it a mobile app, people will try to use it programmatically. If there are resources, if you are exposing, listening on port 80 or 443, you're going to get requests from bots and from programs. And so the web works better, and our content and our apps are more useful if we support programmatic usage, and we actually enable it and we support it. So I think all websites, no matter how you conceive of them, whether they are conceptually on the spectrum between API and application and site, they all need to be good citizens of the web and fully support HTTP so that the web works coherently and cohesively, and it can grow without artificial limitations. Okay, so let's ask ourselves, let's assume for a second I'm right. Grant me that for just a second. Okay, let's say I'm right, and these things are important and they matter. So then why, and these things are part of HTTP, they're not, if you're really deeply familiar with HTTP, if you've obsessed over the spec like I have, then these particular features, these particular requirements, they're not that obscure. So you might ask, why are all these great micro frameworks, which I love so much, why are they getting so much of this wrong to some degree? Not Flask, but Sinatra, Express, getting some of this wrong. So most of them get it wrong to some degree. So what I think it's about is a paradigm mismatch. Again, we're going to get to the practical things in a few minutes. So if this is not your thing, it's fine. Just sit tight. So I think we have a paradigm mismatch here. The frameworks, the semantics of the code and the frameworks, they're all about routes. It's saying, okay, a request comes in for this path, for this method, here's a function. Here's a routine. So just route the request. That's the idea. Route the request, to this routine, to this function. That's the semantics of most of these frameworks. But the web is all about resources. And that means we have a paradigm mismatch, a paradigm dissonance between the paradigm of our code and the paradigm of the web, which is the medium which we are actually implementing our application within. To get concrete about that, I have a bunch of explanations here, but I think the best explanation maybe is in the code. I'll come back to this. So look at this again. This is the Compojure implementation of a route. What this means is create a route that for the path / and the method get responds with hello world. The thing is, this is too specific. The semantics of this code aren't, hey, create a resource that lives at this path and that responds to get this way. It's kind of implied, it's kind of maybe implied, it's indirect, but it's just not the semantics. The semantics here are, here's a route. And in fact, that's the documentation of most of these micro frameworks. They talk about routes and routing. That's what they're for. Compojure is explicitly a routing library. It's barely a framework even. And I think that's not quite right. I think that because the web is all about resources, our code should also be about resources. Code should, in general, I think the code, the semantics of the code that we write and read and work with should minimize any dissonance with the technologies and the platforms it's using and the domain in which it's operating. An example, I don't like ORM, object relational mappers, because I see a dissonance between your code and your relational database. The paradigms there's a disconnect there. It lets you pretend you're dealing with an object database, when in fact you are not dealing with an object database. And that pretend has costs. There are downsides to it. And similarly, these simplistic approaches to HTTP request routing, where you're saying, I want to implement a route, I want to respond to a request to a particular method, a particular path, they let you pretend that the web is essentially RPC. You know, that a request came in for a particular procedure, and I'm just going to respond to that procedure, but it's not. The web isn't RPC. And if you want to make a SOAP service, fine. You know, SOAP is on top of the web. It tunnels over the web. It's not actually of the web, in my opinion. But if you're making a web service, a web application, I'm not going to say the R word. Forget about it. We're not going to go there right now. You should be of the web and in the web and on the web and native. Okay. How are we doing so far? I think I've got enough time to do a gut check here. Too fast? Am I making any sense at all? Hey, that's my bar. That's what I'm going for. Some level of making sense. Okay. So how should they work? How do I think they should work? I think microframeworks should provide a way to define a resource. The semantics of the code should be, I'm going to define a resource, and I'm going to connect a URI to that resource. URI is a universal resource identifier. It's an identifier for that URI. That is the routing. You should route requests to URIs to a resource, not to a routine or a procedure. Concretely, well, I think, yeah. So that's it. That's what I think they should do, but they don't right now. So let's talk about some options for doing it right today, the microframeworks we have. Okay, so I think it's important to get concrete and I want to have some concrete steps and things we can do to improve the situation. So given the microframeworks we have right now today, I want to share some different options I've thought about, and I'd love to hear your guys' opinions, but I have some different options I've thought about for addressing these particular problems I've identified. They're both addressing the very concrete mechanical problems of, you should respond to head, you should respond to options, you should respond with 4 or 5 if an unsupported method comes back, but also kind of the semantic problems. And I've tried to order these options by the degree of effort. So maybe from least to most. So, we'll start small and we'll start not too ambitious. We can all do this probably, but that's not the only thing that matters. There's every person is different, every organization is different, every application is different, has different pros and cons and requirements and context. So if you do want to try out some of these options, or if you want to try this, then just pick the one that works best for you. I'm not promoting any one of these options, and again, if we can come up with other options, I'd love to hear them. So one option is to just use a library or a framework which does it better. If you're using Sinatra, well, use Flask. Just jump all the way to Flask. Of course, there are barriers to doing that. But if you're using Bottle, you might want to switch to Flask. And I'm not saying right now that Flask is intrinsically better than Bottle in every way, but in this particular way it is what I'm asserting. But you'd have to evaluate for yourself, of course, whether that's a viable option for you. So there's a kind of a minimum definition of what I mean when I say it does it better. Well, that's not even true. I think the minimum definition is it responds to head properly. If you define a get route, it should also automatically respond to head requests. It should automatically respond to options, and it should automatically figure out when to send back a 4 or 5 and what to put in that allow header. I'm pretty sure Flask does all this stuff properly. So some options are, of course, Flask. And this is not based on first-hand evidence. I just did a little quick research. But there are some promising options in various platforms, such as potentially Grape, Spark, Node RESTful, Enclosure, Liberator, Bishop. So again, I'm not necessarily recommending, I can only recommend Flask. It's the only one that I know for sure I've worked with closely and I know it's fantastic. The other ones are maybe promising, and this is just a pointer if you are interested in using, I guess, probably not that relevant to this audience right now. Earlier versions of this talk I've given in more multilingual scenarios. Okay, clear? Okay, another option is just wire up the missing routes. So let's say you're using Sinatra and you're stuck with Sinatra, or you're using Compojure and you don't want to do anything else. Well, it's not that hard actually to wire up the missing routes. So, whoops. Why do I have a blank slide? There we go. So this is an example of wiring up the missing routes. This is that Compojure example you saw before with have a resource that responds to a get to slash with hello world. But in order to make this thing behave properly, we also have to implement it ourselves, write the code to implement head, to implement options, and then to implement a fallback, a catch-all route. These are all different routes. So here's a catch-all. It says, oh, catch-all means return 405 and return the proper allow header for both options and any. So I don't want to get caught up in S expressions and explaining list syntax. I hope this is readable. It's basically kind of, think of it as a DSL. Forget that it's Lisp. It's just a DSL for defining routes. Is this understandable? Is this cool, or should I walk through it? Anyone want to walk? The semantics are pretty clear. Just declare all these routes. It's a declarative situation. Declarative, yeah. Okay, so another option is to use a wrapper or a macro or a plugin or a decorator or something like that. Something small, hopefully, which just kind of fixes your framework, patches it, or just enhances it. As an example, I've done this for Compojure. So I've written a macro called resource. And you say, okay, it's declaratively say, I'm defining a resource. It's called root. In this case, I think resources should have names, because resources are concepts. They're not just paths. They are concepts. But I'm not going to go there. It has a name, has a path, and it has methods that it supports. No, these aren't routes. They're methods, because I'm now using a declarative syntax to declare my resource using the concepts and the domain of the web. Using the concepts of the web, which is my domain. I find this exciting because this turns into this. At compile time, it just turns directly into that. It's the same thing. It's almost kind of the same thing as writing all the routes yourself, except now I don't have to do that, and my code is cleaner, but I get the benefits of the full support for the HTTP situation. I've actually released this as a library. It's called Resourceful. It just has the macro, so it's a micro, nano library. But people have gotten value out of it, and that's pretty cool. It's a lot of fun. There's different ways to look at it. You could look at it and say, oh, well, it's just writing your routes for you. It's a shorthand. Or you could say it allows you to write your code using the semantics of your domain, if you're like a philosophy geek like I am. So, however you get value out of it, that's always a good thing. Finally, this is a lot of work, but they're all open source. All these great frameworks are open source, so let's just fix them. Right? Again, I should put my money where my mouth is. but I'm trying. My macro, I'm going to contribute that back to the Compojure project, and I'm going to suggest that they incorporate it. I'm going to prepare a patch with tests and say, hey, build this right into the framework. It won't fix it because the lower level routes will still be there, but at least maybe part of the menu of how people can use Compojure could be to use this higher level macro and to define and declare a resource declaratively using the semantics of the web and get those concrete benefits. But if my premise is compelling, then maybe we can all have a little hand in fixing these frameworks, improving them a little bit. Again, I don't want to be dramatic. I'm not saying they're broken. Maybe I should say improve. We can all improve these frameworks. That's just it's one of the things that's so exciting about open source. Okay, there are the concrete actions we can take to address these problems I've discussed. And I just have one more idea. One more thing I just want to share. This is just kind of where this thinking takes me, where I go with it, is What I've learned from this is I've developed this belief that the semantics of your code should reflect the semantics of your domain. In other words, DSLs are one honking great idea. So let's do more of those. I'll take 2 minutes on this. So my Compojure macro, that one called resource, I think it's an amazing example of how amazing DSLs can be. The code it's clean, it's clear, it's simple, it's straightforward, and it's declarative. And some people think DSLs are just a shorthand. Like, for example, a lot of us use DSLs in testing, writing tests and test frameworks like Cucumber or Behavior, BDD, all sorts of, there's a lot, in Clojure there's one. There's a lot of great DSLs for testing. And for some developers, that's kind of the only main relationship you have with DSLs, well, except for regular expressions. But I mean, I don't know, that's a kind of a counter pattern. It's like so powerful, you'll kill yourself. So, but I think DSLs are more than a shorthand. I think they're a way to express a solution to a problem using the semantics of the problem domain. And this reduces the chances of errors because you don't have a translation step, or you have less of it, you've minimized your translation step. There's always a chance you got the domain wrong, you identified it wrong, you got the semantics wrong in your analysis. But if you are writing your code in the semantics of your domain, then there's, as opposed to, one level lower, then you have that direct connection to your domain and you can express your business logic, or your, not just business, we're not just about business, right? Whatever your logic is, your application logic, you can express in that direct, the stuff of your domain. I think I don't know if I'm explaining this properly, but to me it feels right in my heart that if you eliminate those opportunities for misunderstanding, then it's more likely you're going to have less errors and you're going to have more of a correct solution. I think that's it. So we have a few minutes if we have any objections, heckles. Yes, right here.
Well, I wanted to know, what is your opinion with regards to frameworks that allow you to seamlessly call functions in the server from the client? And since, the code looks much more simple, but it does a lot of black magic to do the RPC.
Gotcha. The question is, what do I think of systems or frameworks which allow you to call server-side functions from a client?
Like the client, you just write the function call, and it calls the function in the server, and it takes care of.
I think that's RPC. It's not the web. The web isn't RPC. It's not an RPC system, in my opinion. And when you do RPC on the web, you are kind of tunneling over the web. You are not using the web in its native paradigm, as a native medium. And if you have a problem where RPC is the correct solution, great, go for it. Use HTTP as a transport and tunnel RPC over HTTP. I have no problems with that at all, but I think it's important to recognize the difference and say that the web is not an RPC system, and to recognize when is the right time to use it, RPC, and when isn't. Next. Yes, sir.
Did you look into these client-side frameworks like Angular, Ember, whatever, and how they behave in this respect? Because they have built-in routing, and I'm not sure what they are doing with the headers and stuff. Did you have looked into that?
So the question is, have I looked into client-side frameworks such as Angular and Ember and how they interact with web applications and web services and web APIs? Is that right? Because they have routing, they have client-side routing. No, I haven't, and I honestly, that to me, I'm a little confused about what that means. I think client-side routing is maybe not the same thing as server-side routing and these request routing at the HTTP level.
You get unique URLs, especially with Angular.
I feel like that might be routing of a URL to a client-side handler as opposed to routing of a URL to a resource, which is something you interact with over a network. I think it might be the same name but two different areas, maybe. I'm not really sure. Gentleman over here in the red.
Last question, by the way.
Okay, yes.
About using frameworks, don't you think that if you handle every aspect of each being properly, like content negotiation, language negotiation, caching, you can just say when to validate your resource, then in order to support all of this, your microframework will turn to a framework.
Okay, so question I believe is, if we improve all these micro frameworks so that they really implement the web resources fully in the full-fledged way, and they're fully in the domain, and all these different things that are in the HTTP spec and different expectations, our micro frameworks are going to become macro frameworks. Am I not concerned about that? It could be a slippery slope. It's possible, but I think it's worth a try. Let me put it that way.
After your improvement, okay, your resource now responds to a head request, but it does not understand accept header, for example. And now what if I want JSON instead of HTML? Now you need something else, and just goes on.
Yeah, it's the possibility of going too far is certainly a possibility. I think we'd have to, when you enhance an existing piece of software that's successful, you have to always be asking yourself, what are the downsides of my enhancement? What are the trade-offs I'm making here? And is it possible for me to go too far? And it's a really good point. I got to run, everybody.
Yes, I'd like
So,
to thank Avi for an excellent presentation.
thank you.